season because the Christmas season is upon us, and a lot of it is about stories. And of course, probably the best known stories behind the Christmas season are the ones that we find in the Gospels, the two Gospels, Matthew and Luke. They helped get the whole thing started somewhere around 2,000 years ago. And even though Christmas has become this sort of a blend of sacred and secular symbols and customs, you really can't take out those Christmas stories in the Gospels and still end up with the same holiday season with the elements that we've become so familiar with that we're about to celebrate. So, regardless of who Jesus is to you, be he Savior, philosopher, or a complete myth, a work of fiction made up by ancient unknown authors. Regardless of who he is to you, the stories are part of our literary history. They are embedded in our culture. They were written by real people who really did live during the Roman occupation of Palestine, where that holy city of Jerusalem, sacred to the Israelites, was about to be annihilated by Roman soldiers. That world of the Jewish people, the one they knew and loved, was about to change forever at the time when Jesus was born. It was about to change so rapidly that they had no time to prepare even. That's the backdrop against which these Christmas stories were originally written. And one of the purposes of these stories was to try to give people a little hope in what looked like a desperate and hopeless kind of a situation. They were written to assure the people that even though this Roman Empire appeared to be winning in terms of physical conquest, it was losing the war of values, and losing badly. Bible scholar Walter Wink, he calls the Roman Empire a domination system. A domination system. Its primary reason for existence was so that the privileged few could dominate and control the masses and get rich in the process at the expense of the common person. That's what was going on. The money went to Rome, and the Jewish collaborators in the higher up places went along with it, and that's what was going on. Which is why the gospel stories, with their messages, many messages, their themes of love, mercy, equality, and justice, that's why they caught on so fast in the world, because that's what the people were living under, that kind of a domination system. These values offered an oppressed people a real alternative in the face of a ruthless domination system, and they're still with us today. They can still offer a real alternative, or at least they should, because there are domination systems operating in the world today, in case you haven't noticed. The Romans and their corrupt collaborators represented a value system that was based on greed, aggression, oppression, terrorism. It was patriarchal, it was highly militaristic, and against that backdrop, we find these wonderfully subversive Christmas stories. They were intended, they were written with the intent to confront and undermine the dysfunctional value system of the day. And they did it by offering an alternative in the form of the life and the teachings of Jesus. The first thing they did in these stories, and this is fascinating, they went after the patriarchy, the male-dominated power structure. The Gospel of Luke in particular did it by making two women the main characters in the story. They were the protagonists. They were the heroes. I'm talking about Mary and her cousin Elizabeth. Here's what Luke tells us about Mary. She was a teenaged unwed mother, right? That was the appearance. Mary and her baby would have been social outcasts. At the very least, they would have been the subject of a lot of snarky gossip, right? Stuff like, oh, did you hear about Mary? Did you hear what she did to poor Joseph? And did you hear who she says the father is? Mary was going to get a reputation. Doesn't matter what kind of a backstory they put out there. Doesn't matter what kind of excuses they tried to make about who the daddy was. Nobody was going to believe it. And yet, when the angel Gabriel appears to Mary in the story from Luke, he says to her, "Greetings, favored one. The Lord is with you." Other translations add the words, "Blessed are you among women." Now think about that for a minute. Consider Mary's situation, and she's being called favored and blessed. Since when has it ever been blessed to be a pregnant, unmarried, teenage woman, no matter who the father was? That's still an issue today with a lot of people. Right off the bat, with the visit from Gabriel, the story is challenging the cultural norms of the day. And it wasn't just the status of Mary either that does that, because the child born out of wedlock would have a tough go of it too. It carried a lifelong stigma like it did for Jesus. These are some parts of the gospel stories that not too many people are aware of. They're not emphasized very much. But there's a good example here when Jesus went back to Nazareth to preach in the synagogue. This is in the Gospel of Mark. He's preaching in the synagogue, and he's in Nazareth, supposedly his hometown, and the townspeople just wrote him off. They listened to him for a while, and then they started saying among themselves, "Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joses and Judas and Simon, and are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. That's Mark chapter 6, verses 1 through 4. Now notice, they refer to him as the son of Mary. Think about that for a minute. In those days, you were the son of your father, if you had one that was known. Even if the father was dead, they still should have referred to Jesus as the son of Joseph, not the son of Mary. By calling him the son of Mary, they're calling him a bastard, illegitimate, illegal, if you will. Okay, later on in the Gospel of John, it's even more blatant. Jesus is talking to a crowd, and they dismiss him by telling him, "We are not illegitimate children. Go away." Disdainful, looking down their noses at him. And yet, this person who was born under those circumstances, who was stigmatized and rejected, goes on to become the teacher of a new set of values. He's the guy that gets to bring this radical message that says that nobody gets left out, nobody gets marginalized, nobody gets treated as less than human or illegal because of a domination system. Nobody gets oppressed because of a dysfunctional social structure that people made up for the purpose of controlling others and making themselves feel superior at the expense of others. That's the message of Jesus in a nutshell. And it's kind of ironic and disappointing to see what's happened to the religion named after the guy who gave us that message, because I see a lot of power plays happening out there. People trying to get special laws passed so that they can marginalize and oppress the people they believe don't live up to their moral standards. Wonderful. Here we go again, right? But if that's not subversive enough for you, there's more to it. Mary goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth. Now remember, Elizabeth was about to become the mother of John the Baptist. Mary's on her way to see her, and this is where we come across one of the most famous passages in the Bible. It's the one that's called the Song of Mary, Or those of you with a Catholic background, you might recognize it by the Latin name Magnificat. And those of you who are into the music scene, you might remember that the Magnificat has been set to music by Bach, Mozart, Bruckner, Rachmaninoff, and others. It's a very famous part of the Bible that has found its way into our classical music culture. So here it is, the Magnificat. That's how it starts out. My soul magnifies the Lord. And during my Catholic seminary days, we heard this so often during the Christmas season that the Latin words are burned into my memory. Magnificat anima mea Dominum. And there's more to it. That's the first line. But it's not until we get several verses into it that we hear this next part. For he has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. Again, we're seeing Mary as this unlikely hero. He has looked with favor on the lowliness of his servant. She knows she's standing down there on the lowest rung of the socioeconomic ladder, and she's not going to let that stop her. Then she goes on to say this, and here's the meat of it right here. She says, he has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. Scattered the proud, brought down the powerful, lifted the lowly, fed the hungry, and sent the rich away empty. How do they keep missing this? Along with everything else. Think about the days back in ancient Israel. If they had a 1% back in those days, these words do not bode well for the 1% in Israel back in the day. And the interesting thing is that you don't have to believe that the events of this story are literally true. You can if you want to. But the important fact is that the story itself really existed. It was composed and circulated in order to bolster and build on the things that Jesus would say later on in the Gospels, and again, to send this radical message to give people a little bit of hope during some really dark times. Through Mary, the author is telling the world that the times, they are a-changing. The social order is going to be upended. The values of the domination system are going to be replaced. It may look like chaos, it may look like destruction at the hand of the Romans, but love and wisdom will always prevail. Okay, if that's not subversive enough for you, there's more. Mary's cousin Elizabeth is next in line. She's the next woman who gets a starring role. That in itself is really unusual in stories. Back in those days anyway. Elizabeth gives birth, and they bring the child to the religious authorities, the patriarchy, to be circumcised and given a name. And the patriarchy automatically just assumes that the boy would be given the same name as his father, or at least someone who was important and honored in the family. But Elizabeth speaks up, and she says, no, his name will be John. Now she has to speak because her husband, Zechariah, had been rendered unable to speak by the angel Gabriel in a scene which occurred earlier. I mean, don't you love it? Shut up, Zechariah. Let Elizabeth do the talking from here on out. A little message being sent here. And after she tells, this is great. After she tells them that the child will be called John, they argue with her. How dare she choose the child's name? Silly woman, doesn't she know there are no other relatives with that name? So they ignore her and they go over to Zechariah. And because they needed someone to mansplain it to her, okay? That's what's going on here. They need Zechariah to put her in her place and mansplain it to her. And he still couldn't talk. So he writes down the words right in front of him. He says, his name is John. Very cool. Not only does he let his woman speak in the synagogue, but then he goes and he agrees with her. What is the world coming to? Well, the patriarchy is officially under assault in this story. And it has to be, because if the things that Jesus was going to say years later about equality were to mean anything, then it meant that women would have to be shown having a voice in the religious assemblies. At least that's what they tried to get rolling back then. Oh, and by the way, right after this, Zechariah does get his voice back. After he writes that down, God says, "You've done good." Gets his voice back. And the first thing that he does is to recite his own song of praise, similar to the one we got from Mary earlier. They call it the Song of Zechariah, which the world has completely ignored. And nobody has bothered to set it to music like the Song of Mary. There's a little more poetic justice there, if you ask me. But again, you don't have to take these stories literally to see how powerful they were and still are today. And even though we don't take them literally, we take them seriously because of the themes that we see. Because they continue to tell us really important things about human nature and the way that human consciousness has been changing. People then were struggling with the same issues that we're having to deal with today. And we may say, "Oh my gosh, can you believe it? Why are we still doing this stuff?" And yet they're meant to give us hope because there was progress. And that's the way it goes. There's progress, and then there's a setback. But the transcendent values that enable us to make progress eventually prevail. It took what? Around 1900 years after those stories were written for women to regain their voices by finally getting the right to vote in what is supposed to be a Christian nation that takes those stories seriously and literally. Well, the stories are here to remind us that authoritarian domination systems will always try to make a comeback. It's reactionary. That's the way it goes. And the message is to be persistent. Keep telling these stories. And make sure that we tell the whole story, and especially the subversive stuff that reminds us to keep stirring the pot, just the way Jesus and his mother did. See you next week.